Everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to the WPAMA. This is a weekly series hosted by WP Buffs. My name is Allie Nimmons. I'm going to be your host today. In case you don't know, we round up your questions every week on a very specific topic and then sit down with a really cool person to answer them live. So if you're just tuning in and you have questions, today's topic is vanilla JavaScript. If you have any questions about that as we're chatting in the next hour, please leave them in the YouTube chat section. And if we have time after the questions we will get to those questions. We also do a random giveaway at the end of every episode. This week, we're giving away one free item from the WP Buff store. So make sure you stick around until the end of the hour and you might be chosen. Only people who have signed up with us via email can win. So go to wpbuffs.com/WP-AMA-series and you can register your email there. You get updates for future episodes and you might win a future prize. This episode will be available to watch here on YouTube in perpetuity. And if you miss any portion, you can go back to the beginning. And captions are going to be included within the next 24 hours. So if you are watching right now and there are no captions, there will be very soon. Alrighty, so this week we are talking about vanilla JavaScript with Chris Ferdinandi. Did I pronounce that right, Chris?
Better than I do myself, so thank you.
Wonderful. Well, welcome, Chris. I'll kind of hand it over to you for a few minutes if you'd like to tell us a little bit about you, about what you do, where you are, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, everyone. So Chris Ferdinandi. I have been told, or I've had the pleasure of hearing real Italian people say my last name before, and it sounds so much nicer than when I say it. I am from ruralish Massachusetts. I live near horse farms, which is pretty nice. And I teach people vanilla JS. My kind of whole thing is I have this really strong belief that there's maybe a simpler and more resilient way to build things for the web than we typically do with a lot of modern development approaches. And so I spend a lot of time talking about and teaching people that. So I have some ebooks and video courses that I've created. I run a remote training program called the Vanilla JS Academy. I host a podcast. I send out a daily newsletter that goes out to about 10,000 or so folks. In what's probably the highlight of my career, Apple actually used one of my open source JavaScript plugins on the Swift website, which is kind of mind-blowing because I'm this self-taught hack that kind of fell into web development by accident. Yeah, love pirates, puppies, Pixar movies. That's probably about it.
Nice.
I'm sorry, what was that, Allie?
Wonderful. Yeah. The 3 Ps, pirates, puppies, and Pixar.
I also love alliteration.
Beautiful. Joel Torres is in the comments. He's watching and he says, hi, Chris. Hi, Joel.
Excellent. Hello.
Cool. All right. So yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. We've been kind of like Twitter friends for a while now, but this is the first time that we are like meeting or
really chatting. Yeah, no, this is awesome.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. We have a couple of questions here, but I'm going to skip those and go to my first question.
Oh, right.
What actually is vanilla JavaScript? So I know generally what JavaScript is. It's a programming language. I feel like it's kind of like when you are on your programming journey, you might go HTML, CSS, and then JavaScript, right? At least that's what I tried to do and failed. So when you say vanilla JavaScript, what does that mean versus, I guess, regular JavaScript?
Yeah, and so I'm going to be a little long-winded, and I apologize. It's just
we have an hour.
It's a failing of me as a person. But so a few years back, when frameworks were kind of really starting to become like the thing, someone, I actually forget who, created a joke website, vanilla-js.com, where they talked about this incredibly fast, lightweight framework that powers the most popular applications on the web, and you can download it. It's only 0 bytes, so it was like this whole thing about this like fake framework. And it started as a joke, and eventually it morphed into this term people use for real. And so vanilla JavaScript means coding with native JavaScript methods and browser APIs instead of frameworks and libraries. So using what's baked into the browser instead of third-party stuff. And I think the term gained a little bit of popularity in part because if you do searches on Google or DuckDuckGo for like how to do X coding thing, you almost always end up on a page that says install jQuery or use React and it's increasingly hard to find things that don't use those tools. And you can write some clever searches that like exclude articles that have those terms in them. But the phrase vanilla.js became a really convenient shorthand for not that stuff. And so I know it irritates people or some people because vanilla.js is just JavaScript. But I find it to be a really nice way to kind of very deliberately articulate that you're talking about JavaScript without all that other stuff. And I think one thing I always like to clarify for folks is when I talk about vanilla JavaScript, I think a lot of folks assume that I am like painstakingly handcrafting every single line of code and everything I create. And I think some people maybe do kind of have that that approach. But for me, vanilla.js is more of like a mindset than a very strict kind of approach to coding. And so I use other people's code all the time. I actually think it's, unless you're doing it for learning purposes, it's maybe a bit silly to not take advantage of some of the awesome stuff that's out there, particularly for things that are really difficult or outside of kind of your realm of expertise. And I always think about vanilla JavaScript more as being deliberate about the tools you choose, reaching for them when it is like exceedingly difficult to do something without them. And then I think the third component here is, as an industry, we have a tendency to always go for like the multi-purpose tools that do a lot of things. You know, like we go for the Swiss Army knife when all you really need is a pair of scissors. And so, you know, when you do use third-party stuff, which I think is totally acceptable, I try to advocate for maybe choosing things that are a little bit more lean and lightweight and focused on doing one thing really well rather than all the things.
Quality over quantity.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a lot. The short answer is vanilla.js is not the libraries and frameworks. It's just using what the browser does out of the box.
That makes a lot of sense. But that was great context for understanding, you know, why it would be beneficial or, you know, why you choose to use it over, I guess, full JavaScript. Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. So let's hop into the first question. It looks like some of these might be specific to just JavaScript in general. So
totally fine.
Totally fine. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
So the first question is, where in WordPress is JavaScript mostly used? What functions are best used for JavaScript as opposed to PHP or HTML? So I think that's a really good question if somebody's looking to start coding WordPress stuff. You know, where am I going to focus the JavaScript at?
Yeah, for sure. And so this obviously varies a bit from plugin to plugin, from theme to theme. One of the things I've noticed is WordPress as a community has started to shift more to JavaScript for stuff that maybe historically used to be more PHP based. And a lot of that comes from the top. I know you know, Matt Mullenweg and others have really been pushing for this like notion of learning JavaScript deeply. And I think that's great. One thing I will personally say is I think WordPress is maybe swinging a little bit too far into the JavaScript end of things. And I say this as someone who teaches JavaScript professionally for a living, but I really want us as an industry to use less of it. JavaScript is both the slowest part of the stack and the most fragile. So just as a factor of how browsers kind of download and parse and compile and run JavaScript, it is very expensive for browsers to kind of work with, and has the biggest performance implications. And it's also, when it fails catastrophically. So like if you mistype a CSS property or forget to close off an HTML tag or type the wrong kind of text there, the browser just kind of handles it and keeps moving on. But with JavaScript, it fails. And so I really love doing things in PHP or a backend language when you can, because it's just so much more resilient and performant for the end user. But to answer the actual question here, I think the things where JavaScript works best is for interactive stuff. So if you have things that you want to expand or collapse when you click them, or you want to conditionally bring in some content only if the user does a particular thing. You want to show state. So like you have a form, and when someone clicks submit, you just kind of want to indicate to them visually somehow that that form is submitting. I think those, for me personally, are the kinds of things where I think JavaScript really shines. And the area where I think WordPress has been pushing people more that I actually don't love is the idea that we should be rendering all of our markup with JavaScript. I personally still think server-side rendering is better for a lot of that stuff. I understand why there's maybe a bit more of a push there, but I don't love it. I don't know if that actually answers the question or not. Admittedly, I don't work with WordPress quite as much, and when I do, I use it more as a headless backend these days.
Okay.
Which we can also talk about if people want.
For sure. Yeah, I think that answered the question. Well, if that person is here and that did not answer the question, then let us know or specify, and we'll revisit that. But yeah, let's move on to question number 2. Sure. So what's the difference between Java and JavaScript? Is HTML or other languages tied into that? So I guess tied into JavaScript.
Sure, great question. And I am almost certainly going to butcher this a little bit because my knowledge of JavaScript history is not terrific. But Java and JavaScript are two completely different languages. Java is a server-side language. JavaScript is a client-side language, so it runs in the browser, although now with Node.js, you can also run it on the server, although it didn't start that way. It is so named because initially it borrowed some of its conventions from the Java programming language. But the two are completely unrelated. And if you put that you have JavaScript experience on your resume, you will almost certainly get emails from recruiters trying to hire you for Java roles, because that's just the way it goes. Yeah, and so the big, I guess the real, it used to be really easy historically to say JavaScript runs in the browser, Java runs on the server, but these days JavaScript also runs on the server. And you see plenty of kind of server-side applications built with JavaScript as well, which is part of what's so cool and powerful about it. There was also kind of a question tucked in there about its relationship to HTML and so on. So within a website, there are 3 different languages that all come together to make a website work. The foundation, the bones of any website are the HTML, and it's really the only required part of a website. And these are the elements on the page. You might have a button element, a paragraph element with some text in it, an image element that has a picture, and so on. And that is, like, if you were to think about a house, that is the, all the lumber and all the supplies that go into making a web page.
Right.
CSS is the blueprints that tell everything where it should go and how it should look. And then JavaScript is kind of this magical little scripting language that sits on top, and you can use to do all sorts of dynamic stuff in real time in the browser. And so JavaScript is what does things like add interactivity. You can use JavaScript to create and inject HTML into a page, which is pretty neat as well. I lost my train of thought at somewhere in the middle of this long rant. But the short answer is it is one of the 3 kind of core languages of the front end, and it is specifically the scripty part that allows you to do cool interactive kind of programmatic stuff in a way that you can't necessarily do with HTML or CSS.
I always kind of thought of it like HTML is what something is, CSS is what it looks like, and JavaScript is what it does. I mean, that's boiled down very, very, very simply, but if you were explaining it to, a 5-year-old. I feel like that's the main difference, and then you can kind of specify from there.
It is, yes. No, that's a good one. I like that.
Cool. All right, question 3. How long do you think it took before JavaScript clicked for you? And what was the hardest part of JavaScript to get your head around?
Okay, so
going back to when you were learning.
Yeah, I remember this vividly because JavaScript was
Mm-hmm.
very painful for me. It took a really long time. I want to say I had been programming for like I'd been doing web development for like 2, maybe 3 years before it really clicked. And a big part of the challenge for me with JavaScript was I learned HTML and CSS first, and I feel like those languages are authored in a way that feels more conversational, for lack of a better word. So like HTML elements are usually pretty descriptive of what they are. And even CSS, the conventions you use to style things tend to follow like a plain English kind of thing. You know, so if I want to change the background color, I use the background-color property. If I want to change the size of something, I use the font size property. And it makes, it felt a little bit more natural. JavaScript tends to use weird terms for a lot of things. Some stuff is obvious, like get element by ID, get an element by its ID. But there's a lot of stuff that doesn't, and like the conventions from one method to another aren't always like consistent. And I also don't have a computer science degree, and I always kind of early on felt like you needed one to learn this stuff. I've since learned that's complete hogwash, but at the time I was like, oh, I don't have a computer science degree, I'm never going to be able to understand this. The thing that made it all click for me, honestly, was jQuery. jQuery has absolutely fantastic documentation. That is another thing that Vanilla.js really suffers from, is there's not like a single written for beginners, plain English kind of documentation thing. I think MDN, or the Mozilla Developer Network, is the closest we've got. And some articles are better than others because a lot of it is community generated. So jQuery having a very consistent API, having methods that were really descriptive about what they did, like the add class method adds a class, and the remove class method, you know, it's all very, very simple, and they have a lot of examples. That is what really made JavaScript start to click for me. And then I spent like a year taking a bunch of stuff I built in jQuery and then reverse engineering it into plain old vanilla JavaScript. And that's when everything started to really, really come together for me. The other thing too is when I initially started learning, JavaScript was really inconsistent between different browsers. Not all methods and APIs and approaches worked everywhere. And that has since gotten a lot better. Modern JavaScript borrowed heavily from jQuery, and standards kind of finally came into their own. And so now, you know, between the 4 or 5 major browsers, they all do things the same way. They are all mostly on par with features, although there are some exceptions. So it becomes a lot easier to kind of, I think it's easier to do today than it was back when I was learning, as long as you ignore like all the noise around frameworks and tooling and all that, which is a big if. But yeah, that was kind of my journey. It was a lot. It was really hard. I bombed a ton of interviews because I just could not wrap my head around JavaScript for the longest time. And now I teach it.
There you go. Success story, right? Yeah, I've tried learning to code so many times, and JavaScript is always where I hit the wall. So yeah, if you're out there and you're watching and you've tried learning JavaScript, just remember, I think everyone kind of struggles with it until they don't, you know. And that's a really good reason, as far as your explanation of like the way that it's written is really not as much like HTML and CSS to me are very similar. It's just like thing I want thing to do, or thing I want thing to be or look like, or whatever. And yeah, JavaScript's not as cut and dry as that.
The flip side is I know a lot of people who learn JavaScript first and they cannot wrap their head around CS, like they really like trying
Oh,
to learn
wow.
CSS, they really struggle. And I think it's just like they're two very different ways of thinking about things. And a lot of it just
Yeah.
comes down to that. Like whichever one you get first, the other one will probably be hard for you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Question number 4. So I don't actually know what this is. They ask 11T or WordPress? 11TY or WordPress?
Yes.
Which tool and when is the question.
Okay. This is going to sound a little sacrilegious because of the channel that we're on, but
Oh, no.
11T always, WordPress almost never. No, I'm sorry. Let me be a little less flippant here. So Ali, just for your benefit, 11T is, and I guess for anybody else who doesn't know, so 11T is a static site generator. If you're familiar with like Jekyll or Hugo, or one of those tools, it's just another static site generator. Just in terms of static site generators between WordPress generally, I almost always favor static site generators. And if you're not familiar with what those are, way back in the day before WordPress and other CMSs ever existed, you had to hand code all of the HTML on every page for your entire website. And if you wanted to change the navigation menu on one page, you had to go through and change it on all your other pages too, by hand. WordPress and others like it are amazing because you separate the content from the layout. And so you have templates and you have content, and WordPress smushes them together for you and spits out the HTML. Where WordPress tends to fall a little flat, or where it struggles today, is twofold. First, it generates, by default, it generates a website that someone wants to visit, or the HTML for a web page someone wants to visit on your site in real time, in the moment that it's requested. So if someone goes to, aliesawesomewebsite.com, WordPress is going to create that HTML view from your content in the database and your template files when it's requested. Doesn't do it ahead of time. And there are some plugins that will tell it to build them ahead of time, but by default, it doesn't do that. And that can be a little slow, especially if you're running on like shared, inexpensive hosting, like a lot of us are, because it's widely available and cheap, and why not? And so you see the average WordPress site tends to take a long time to load relative to some other sites. And the other piece of it is, over time, WordPress has added a lot of abstractions, a lot of functions, a lot of kind of helper code, and they rightly are very concerned with backwards compatibility. So when new methods come out that make things easier, the old stuff stays in too, because if they removed it, they would break a ton of old sites that are running on WordPress. Right. So all of that stuff tends to like really slow things down over time, just in terms of kind of how fast things run on a WordPress site. Static site generators take some of the best that WordPress does and other CMSs, where you've got content and templates and they're separate, and it combines it with the thing that was really nice about the old hand-coded HTML files, which is that they are really, really fast, because when you request a file from the server, it doesn't have to build anything. The file's already there and it just sends it back. And so the way static site generators work is you still author your content. It doesn't live in a database. It lives in like these flat, like markdown files. And then you have templates that can be authored in HTML or JavaScript or Ruby or PHP or whatever your kind of preferred language is there. And it takes the content and takes the templates and smushes them together. But the difference is it does that ahead of time. So you run a build and it compiles everything on your site. And then those HTML files are what lives on your server, rather than the thing that builds them. So for most websites these days, I prefer using a tool like 11D, because I think that it provides better performance. And it also means that if you get a surge of traffic for some weird reason, it's way less likely that your site is going to fail. Ali, I don't know if you remember the term fireballing and when that used to happen on the web. I'm really, getting old, as people can probably tell from my receding hairline here. But about a decade ago, the website Daring Fireball, who writes about Mac stuff, used to be really, really popular. There was like way less blogging going on. And it was one of like the big blogs of the early to mid 2000s. And whenever he would link to some random little website on the web, if they weren't used to getting a ton of traffic, the surge they would get from him, very popular blogger, sending people there, would completely cripple the WordPress database on that site, and the whole site would come crashing down. And you sometimes see that today with like spikes of traffic, like cripple servers. And static site generators prevent that from happening. Long-winded kind of thing here, but I think what I really want to circle back to is I almost feel like in some ways this is a false dichotomy, because you can use WordPress and Eleventy together, and it is absolutely amazing. It's like the best of both worlds. So WordPress has a content API, which is absolutely amazing. They actually have just a custom REST API altogether. So you can add your own endpoints and do all sorts of fun things. But out of the box, you can call an API and get a list back of all of the content on your entire site. So one of the neat things you can do is you can author your content in WordPress and use it as a CMS, and you get the WYSIWYG and kind of all the niceties that come with that. And then using Eleventy, you can actually make an API call to your WordPress site, get all of the content back, use it to generate flat HTML files, and then serve those. So yeah, I am just generally speaking, for front-facing things, I like to use static site generators. For kind of, I need to do stuff on a server, I still love and use WordPress all the time. I even use it to kind of manage user accounts and credentials and passwords and things like that for like the platform that powers my courses and where everybody accesses all that stuff. So great question, bit of a false dichotomy. You can use both, you can use them together. If I had to choose just one, I would pick Eleventy.
There you go. Yeah, that's so cool. I had no idea. I was familiar with the concept of like a static site generator, but I haven't heard about Eleventy. So I might go look. I mean, I Googled it while you were describing it, and definitely something it looks like I want to play with. Plus, it seems like the guy who invented it actually looks like Matt Mullenweg, which I find absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, they're
so yeah.
they're the new kid on the block. So Eleventy just came out. Oh God, I guess it's been like 2 or 3 years ago now, but of all of the static site generators, Gatsby may be a little bit newer, but like they don't have like big funding or everything. Zach Leatherman, the guy who created it, is just the nicest human being on the planet. It's neat because it does things that some of the other static site generators don't or can't. And a big part of the reason why is because it's built on top of JavaScript instead of like another language. And so there's a lot of flexibility that comes from that. Some kind of annoying things too, just because of how JavaScript is, but yeah, it's a really great tool. Highly recommend it.
Awesome. All right, so question number 5. Should I learn vanilla JavaScript first or a framework or library first?
Sure. Great question. Get it all the time. I'm trying to think of I don't have a pithy response for this one. So the answer is yes. I guess that is pithy. That was unintentionally pithy. I really strongly feel that learning momentum is so much more important than picking the right tool when you're just starting this journey. And I think the worst thing that can happen for a learner is you get really hung up on like picking the right tool. You start to learn that. You get stuck and you get frustrated and you give up. I guess to frame that in a more positive way, I think it is really important for beginners to go from, I have a thing I want to do, to I did it as quickly as possible, because that is where the kind of the excitement over the process and seeing what you can do like really clicks and keeps you going. And I think these days, modern vanilla JavaScript is about as easy to learn as jQuery. And if I were like, if you were like forcing me to choose just one, like which one should I do? I would say give it a try. But if you find it confusing or you're not getting it and you look at the jQuery documentation and you're like, oh, that makes more sense, I want to do that. Do it. Like, don't like get dogmatically hung up on this is the thing I have to do first. it is totally acceptable to go with jQuery or Vue or React if you find those easier, and then back into vanilla JavaScript later. For me, I think the much more important thing is not when you learn vanilla JS. I think it's important that people who do things with JavaScript regularly eventually learn it, because understanding kind of the conventions, understanding how code works under the hood means that you're going to make different decisions about how you write code in the libraries and frameworks. You're going to approach things differently. You're going to solve problems differently. If I was being a little bit controversial, I would say you're going to solve problems and write your code better, because you start to understand the performance implications, kind of the unintended side effects of how certain things work. And like I started with jQuery, I learned vanilla JavaScript later, and I found that learning vanilla JS made me write my code in jQuery better because I picked up all these new conventions and patterns that I hadn't like realized you could do before. Yeah, so don't get hung up on what order to learn things in. I'd say look at the docs for all of your options. If one of them seems like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, I can get going with this right now, do that one. Don't like waste your time trying to pick the perfect thing, because there is no perfect thing. Yeah. Allie, you were on mute.
Whoops, sorry about that.
No worries at all.
What I said was, that was a really good answer. Yeah, I was putting the questions in the chat and I didn't want my typing noise to disrupt you. Awesome. Yeah, next question. This is interesting, and I don't know what these things are either, so I'm excited to learn. Do you see Jamstack or SSGs taking over some of the traditional space of WordPress and other sites that need a backend?
Yes. So for people who don't know, Jamstack is an acronym that stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. SSG is an acronym for static site generator. Sorry, let me let her out of the room.
Okay. I love dog interruptions. Best kind of meeting interruption.
That means someone's probably at my door. Sorry about that. She's normally like
No
just
worries.
passed out in my room all day. Yeah. So static site generators like 11D, Hugo, Jekyll, etc. So Jamstack is kind of a buzzword to describe the approach we were just talking about with static site generators. And so people tend to get really kind of fixated on the J in Jamstack, the JavaScript. The thing that makes Jamstack is that your server, it's the M, the markup is the most important part. So a Jamstack website is a site where the thing that gets sent to the person who's requesting your site is pre-compiled HTML. That can literally mean like the whole website is just an HTML file that you hand coded. It could mean it's something you built with a static site generator. It could be a single page app that later gets rendered with some client-side JavaScript. Or it could be some kind of in the middle thing where you've got some HTML in there and then some stuff that kind of gets dynamically generated with JS later. So there's a bit of a spectrum here. To answer the actual question, yes, I absolutely do believe that Jamstack and static site generators are encroaching on some of the space that WordPress used to occupy. And I think that's a good thing, because I think Jamstack brings with it a lot of performance gains that traditional database-driven kind of server-rendered HTML just can't compete with. It is, it's just like, because of like the laws of physics, it's just faster to send a already existing HTML file than it is to wait for one to get built on the server. It's also, with flat HTML files, easier to push them out to CDNs and have them kind of sit closer to where the end user is. Generating content from APIs instead of kind of have everything live in a database reduces the overall risk platform of a website in terms of things like hacking. You know, like WordPress, just by virtue of their popularity, is notorious for having like database hacks happen on like poorly secured websites that use bad passwords and things like that. Happened to me back in the day. The thing though, we talked about this a little bit already, is it's encroaching on some of what WordPress does, but it's not necessarily replacing it. I still think one of the best things WordPress ever did was build their REST API platform on top of WordPress. So the content API is cool, but I think the even more interesting part is the fact that you can write your own REST endpoints to do additional stuff. So like I use WordPress as a way to manage all of the users on my platform. And so my learning portal is actually static site generated flat HTML that makes calls to the WordPress REST API to authenticate people, to get the content they have access to handle kind of password changes and all this stuff. And I see WordPress playing this really interesting role as like the server-based API engine that feeds stuff you can do with Jamstack and static site generators.
Right.
And not always. Like my website, gomakethings.com, is just flat HTML that I write in Markdown because it doesn't need that interactivity. But yeah, it's one of the, I see it encroaching, but I don't necessarily see it as replacing because I think they both have a place, and I think they work nicely together.
Wonderful. Alrighty. Cool. We have time for a couple more questions.
Awesome.
One question that we did get in the chat, which is it seems like a very general question, but I guess we can look at it from a JavaScript perspective. Why does WordPress get a bad rap as being outdated and slow?
Yeah.
Fighting words.
Yeah, no, great question. So the TLDR answer is because it is. The more generous and I think nuanced answer is it kind of is, but it's also not. So we talked a little bit already about how WordPress, first of all, I don't think it's fair to say it's outdated, but one of the big challenges that WordPress has always been hindered with is they care deeply about not breaking sites that were built on it before. So when they do a big version update, they're really cautious not to break existing sites that are running on the platform. And I've got to tell you, as an engineer, as someone who's built a lot of websites, I appreciate that so damn much, because the worst kind of nightmare situation for me would be having a bunch of old clients say, my site stopped working. I clicked update and everything's broken. So the backwards compatibility is huge. It's a little bit like golden handcuffs for WordPress, though, because while that is also the best thing about the platform, or one of the best things about the platform, it also means that every time they do something new, it doesn't replace something old. It just kind of adds to what's already there. And so the code base never really gets smaller as new kind of approaches and techniques come out. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think if they were starting today, they would absolutely make a lot of different engineering choices than they made 10, 15 years ago. But they're stuck with a lot of those choices because they made them and they're in the platform now, and they're not just going to throw them out.
Right.
And so in that regard, WordPress is old, and it does use some slightly outdated things. Like given the kind of this push into React and JavaScript, I think it's pretty clear that if they were to build WordPress today, it would probably be built on Node and not PHP. Part of this is just the developer community being weird and fickle. There's always been kind of this like PHP bashing thing that's happened in the developer community. It's nonsense. I love PHP. It runs everywhere. It's really stable. It's reliable. It's well documented. Love it. PHP is a great language. That is my tiny hill to die on. But yeah, so the other piece too that we've touched on a little bit is because of how WordPress generates content, this kind of in real time on the server, it is inherently slower than some other newer techniques. And it doesn't have to be. I think you look at like what WordPress.com does, and especially with their VIP service, where you've got these massive corporate sites that are running on WordPress, they are really, really fast. It doesn't have to be slow. But some of the defaults built into WordPress are slow. And most of us who run WordPress do it on like $5 hosting from GoDaddy or Bluehost or HostGator. And that is not great hosting. It's affordable hosting. But for $5 a month, you're not getting these hyper optimized servers that can handle massive read writes and tons of real-time operations. And so in that regard, WordPress is on those installs going to be slower. So I think that's where a lot of the reputation comes from. Some of it is earned. Some of it is just our community being kind of mean about like old tech. Yeah. I still like WordPress though. I don't think that means you shouldn't use it. I think we just need to be a little bit more like selective about what we use it for and how. And if you want cheap hosting, by the way, just as a quick aside, for $5 a month, you can get a droplet on DigitalOcean. There are these virtualized SSD-based servers, and they are so much faster than kind of the more traditional hosting for $5 a month you can get elsewhere. I don't think they don't pay me to say that or anything. I run about a dozen websites on a single $5 a month server, and they're all really, really fast. Like I can't recommend them enough.
Very cool. But yeah, no, I like that you kind of challenge the idea that like I feel like a lot of people I encounter are sort of like WordPress for everything, like WordPress or nothing. And it's interesting and refreshing to hear reasons and support for saying, okay, well, you can use WordPress for some things, but there are other resources for other use cases, and that's just as valid, and it doesn't mean WordPress is bad. And I think that that's really valuable, a really valuable concept for people to be comfortable talking about and to be open to. Because even up until this morning, that's kind of always just been my thought process, is like, I will never touch anything that's not WordPress. And so it's important to have that kind of open mind. Joel actually just asked in the chat, does DigitalOcean have staging for those hosting accounts?
Oh, I don't know. Because I only end up using WordPress as a backend for a lot of my stuff now. I haven't thought about that in years, and I tend to, my staging environment is like runs local on my machine, and then I push over. So I don't actually know the answer to that, Joel. I'm really sorry.
That's okay. I'm sure that they would have information on their website about having that as a feature or how to go ahead and set that up. So yeah, definitely I'd recommend going and looking that up. All right, we have time for maybe two more.
Awesome.
I love this question. I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but what's so bad about using JavaScript frameworks? Like, I guess, why would somebody want to rely on vanilla JavaScript and say, forget the frameworks, I'm just going to stick to this? Like, what's so bad about using a framework as opposed to not?
Literally everything. No. So the problem with JavaScript frameworks, there are a few. There are some really nice things they do too. So I think one of the best things JavaScript frameworks do is if you need to render a bunch of user interface and you have all these different elements that change based on different situations, like a really complex app, they make handling that really easy, because kind of at the heart of most frameworks is this idea of state-based UI, where like when a change happens, rather than trying to figure out what are the elements in the UI currently and how do I need to change them, you say, I have this data, based on this data, this is how the UI should look. And then if something changes, you change the data and the framework figures everything else out for you. And that's awesome. The problem with frameworks from my perspective is they start with a base of 30 kilobytes of JavaScript, which doesn't sound like a lot, but like a kilobyte of JavaScript is so much slower than a kilobyte of JPEG or HTML or CSS, just by nature of how browsers work. They have to download the file, and then it comes over in like 14 kilobyte at a time chunks. And then in the case of like React at 30 kilobytes, that's actually 30 kilobytes gzipped. So once it gets expanded out, it's like substantially larger than that. And then JavaScript has to combine all these bits, run through the whole thing, and then it can actually, like, once it's read through it once, then it can start running it. And so all of that kind of code adds a lot of latency to the front end, both in terms of initial startup time and then even interactive times after that. So a couple of data points here. Zach Leatherman, the guy who built Eleventy, he did an experiment last year where he took every single one of his, it's like either 12 or 15,000 tweets, and created one massive, I need to figure out the size on this. It was several megabytes in size. He created a website with every single one of his tweets on it. And then he took one tweet and he built a React site with it. And okay, here we go. Sorry. Let me read the actual quote. So Zach said, which has a better first meaningful paint time? A raw 8.5 megabyte HTML file with the full text of every single one of my 27,000 tweets, or a client rendered React site with exactly one tweet on it. The 8.5 megabyte HTML file was faster by about 1/5 of a second. So just doing some quick back of the napkin math, that 8.5 megabyte HTML file is 144 times bigger than the React rendered site with one tweet on it. And it is perceptibly faster, about 1/5 of a second is human perceptible, than the React site, which is just completely bonkers and mind-blowing. Like, HTML is just so much faster. The other piece of this is earlier this year, Jeremy, why am I drawing a blank on his name right now? I need to look this up. Forgive me. So my friend Jeremy, whose last name I'm forgetting, Jeremy, I'm really sorry I'm not remembering your last name. I'm having a post-lunch senior moment. So there's an article on CSS tricks. I'll make sure Jeremy Wagner, there we go, sorry. He wrote an article on CSS tricks where he looked at Vanilla.js, React, and Preact, which is a 3 kilobyte alternative to React that uses the same kind of API. He looked at kind of rendering an initial UI with all three of those, and then handling UI changes and interactive kind of changes with those. What he found was that React was like 30 times slower than Vanilla.js and 10 times slower than Preact. So like, it's not just, it's not just like Vanilla.js is faster. It's like the more abstraction and the more JS you throw at the front end, the slower it becomes. But, I think one of the counter arguments you get here is like, well, that's only for the initial page load. And then like after that, everything's really snappy. And what Jeremy found was that with Vanilla.js, it's still faster to update interactions. And even using something like Preact was 5 times faster to handle user interactions than React was. I've heard a lot of people talk about like, well, if you're building apps at scale, you really need React or your performance gets sluggish. And that's just absolutely not true. There are reasons why you may want to use a framework, but generally speaking, they don't just instantly give you this like magic performance boost on your site. In fact, they usually have the opposite effect. And so to bring this full circle, the reason why I think frameworks are so bad is because they were built to solve a very narrow set of problems. And that is specifically building really complex user interfaces with massive amounts of data sets and huge amounts of elements. So React was built by Facebook. If you ever look at the Facebook UI, or the Twitter UI, it is this nested div soup where you've got like 8 levels of nested div just to render a button. Like, it's really comical. And so in a situation like that, when you need to change something based on a user interaction, like crawling all the way down to those 8 elements is actually really slow in like a traditional vanilla JavaScript approach, just because of kind of how the DOM works. But most of us aren't building apps that are like Facebook or Twitter sized big. And so we're like basically using a sledgehammer to like hang a painting. You know what I mean? Like, when a different smaller tool is probably a better approach. And so my general rule of thumb is, if you can get by without a framework, don't. If you're doing a lot of kind of user interaction and like changing the UI based on that, I think a framework or library is actually a good choice. Maybe don't use React or Angular or Vue. Pick something that's smaller. Preact is a really nice choice. Svelte is a really, really cool one that gives you like a framework authoring experience, but then compiles into vanilla JS. And so it's really, really fast and performant. And then if you're building something just as like god awfully massive as Facebook or Twitter, yeah, sure. React is probably actually a better choice for you there. But in most cases, it's probably not. Yeah, so that's why I think frameworks are bad. On top of that, like JavaScript is really fragile, easy to break. It's just too much JS and it's crippling the web.
There you go. All right, so that is the end of our questions. We're going to go ahead and cap off there. Chris, thank you so much for giving us some time out of your Wednesday afternoon to talk about JavaScript. Where can people find you if they want to get more content from you, or more about JavaScript, or just ask you more questions?
Yeah, awesome. So the best place is gomakethings.com. You can sign up for my daily newsletter. You can find all my contact information if you want to email me or jump on Twitter and yell at me and tell me how mind-numbingly wrong I am about everything we've talked about today. Yeah, gomakethings.com. That's my home on the web.
Fantastic. Wonderful. All right. And before we log off, it's time to announce our random giveaway winner. This week's winner is Joel. Congrats, Joel. We are going to email you at the email address that you provided so that you can go and grab your prize. Alrighty, everyone, we will see you next week. Make sure to go to wpbuffs.com/WP-AMA-series. Sign up there for early access to the next speaker so that you could submit your questions first. And if you want to find out more about us, go to wpbuffs.com, find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter by searching WP Buffs. And right here on the same YouTube channel, we have podcasts, we have YouTube tutorial series, a bunch of other content for you to fill your brain and your eyes with. So that's all, folks, and have a good one. All right, stream is ended. We are no longer live.